Thank you very much. And thank you, Hanno, for that. That's the theory, which I mean, as he knows, I only understand about half of it. And I'm going to talk about the practice. And as you all know, the basic foundation of Western diplomacy is that we in the West know, well, everything actually, and that anybody else, well, they don't know very much, if anything. So when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, this was great news because this was the end of the Cold War and fantastic. And an awful lot of things had to be done in Moscow, and he had to sort of dismantle the Soviet Union and privatize and democratize and all that sort of thing. But he didn't know how to do it from our point of view. I mean, how could he? He was a communist. So lots of experts went over to Moscow to tell him what to do. One was a Czech, and his name was Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hoch. Well, he was originally a Czech. Then he became an Englishman. Next, he became a fraudster. And after that, he became a socialist member of parliament. And when I was old enough to vote, I was old enough to drink. And I voted for the first time and drank not for the first time. And everybody in the pub, when he got elected in what was my constituency in England, everybody knew that he was a crook. In fact, his nickname was the Bouncing Czech. And on democratization, what the experts were saying to Mr. Gorbachev was, what you have to do is you have elections, and then you have a parliament, you can call it a Duma if you like, and then you, as the executive, you will propose legislation, and they will debate it and argue and blah, blah, blah. But eventually they take a vote, and if you get a majority, that law can then be enacted. And the word in English is majoritarianism. So we were saying, Mr. Gorbachev, you need majoritarianism. But Mr. Gorbachev doesn't speak English, so you have to translate it into Russian. So you say, Mikhail Sergeyevich, вам нужен, and the word for majoritarianism is Bolshevism. So we would, oh dear, well, never mind. The history of majority voting goes back a long way. The majority voting was first used by the Greeks and the Chinese over 2,000 years ago. And it worked fairly well in both jurisdictions, partly because there were no political parties in either. The first person to notice that anything might be not very good about majority voting was Pliny the Younger in the year AD 105, who realized that when there are 3 or more options on the table, if there is no majority for any one thing, there will be a majority against everything. And so we had, later on in Europe, after the Dark Ages, people were suggesting preferential voting. Ramon Llull, who lived in either Catalonia or Spain or both, depending on your point of view, and then Nicholas Casanos. And the first person to do anything serious about it was Jean-Charles de Borda, and he looked at the mathematics and so on. And this was in 1770 in France, and France was going through interesting times, and then there was revolution and God knows what. And he was in the French Academy of Sciences, and they adopted the Borda method. It wasn't perfect, but it was sort of okay. And then there was a new person came along, and the Academy of Sciences changed its name, and the new boss in charge, he said, no, forget all this consensus nonsense. Let's just go back to majority voting. And Napoleon Bonaparte became the first democratic dictator, of which there have been quite a few. And Napoleon was actually a bit of an amateur. He only got 99%. The first person to get 100%, I'm very proud of this, was an Irishman, Bernardo O'Higgins, and he became El Supremo, a feat that has been repeated by Saddam Hussein. So, unfortunately, yeah, after that, in France, nowadays hardly anybody knows who de Borda was. And politicians prefer majority voting, and I'm afraid it's terribly unscientific, as we've just heard, but it's still being used. So let's have a look a little bit at the theory. And if you have option X, yes or no, and I am talking about decision-making, not elections. Option X, yes or no, well, you can't identify the will of the people by such a question because it has to be identified earlier if it's going to be already on the ballot paper. So it's a bit silly, really. Secondly, you cannot identify the collective will if certain individuals are not expressing their individual wills, if they are only saying, no, I don't want that. Nah. So the logic is that a yes or no question is no good at all. And to identify an accurate collective will in a pluralist democracy, modern 21st century and all that sort of thing, you have to allow every option to be on the table, or at least a short list. I want this, you want that, somebody else wants something else, fine. And in politics, it's very difficult to find a question that is actually dichotomous. I suppose there was one, actually, and that was in Sweden. And they had the question, very controversial, which side of the road should we drive on? And they had a referendum. And the referendum had 3 options on the ballot paper. So if you were the totally committed Democrat and you really wanted to participate, but actually on this question, you'll just go with the flow, so you could vote blank. And 40,000 people, this was November, pretty cold in Sweden in those days, and they put on their boots and they voted blank. Okay. Oh, and the result, by the way, was this. They all voted left, so the government said, oh, you silly people, and they said, you're going to drive on the right whether you like it or not. But if we come now to a more controversial question, like Brexit, which always was multi-optional, and this is a possible list of 5 options. And to have a majority vote on any one of them is, quite honestly, a little bit silly. Because if you consider the sort of profile like that, 20 people, and 6 of them like A, and 5 like E, and blah, 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 so there is a majority against everything, as Pliny the Younger would have told us. And in the United Kingdom, which unfortunately I happen to be a citizen of, the only question asked was A, yes or no. And they changed it to remain or leave, but it's the same thing. So a majority vote on a multi-option question, yeah, if there's no majority for any one thing, there will be a majority against everything, and it's just a silly way of doing things. Not only silly, England is now more divided than it has been forever, actually. So basically what we should do, perhaps, is have a look at people's preferences, as Hanno has just been showing us. And I've added one other person has joined the fray now, and he is a supporter of option F. And F is for the United Kingdom to be the 51st state of America. Bit of a silly option, actually, and everybody thinks it's a silly option. All the other 20 think it's a silly option. It's their last preference. But F is adamant about this. That's the only thing he's going to vote for, and what the hell. So if we look at that voter's profile, and you'll see the 6 people on the left, they have preferences A, B, C, D, E. But it is a divided society because the next 5 people have the very opposite, E, D, C, B, A. And maybe there is a bit of a consensus perhaps in C or D or B. And if we look at B, then it's got only 2 first preferences, but it has, wow, 13 second preferences. Maybe that best represents the consensus, the collective will. But as Hanno has just shown us, if you take a plurality vote, then it's option A, which is the winner. If you take a 2-round vote, it'll be between A and E in the second round. And E, well, there are 5 and 4 and 3 people who prefer E to A, so E wins by 12 to 8. If you have the alternative vote, or as the Americans called IRV, instant runoff voting, then you eliminate F. That's no good. Then you eliminate B, and its 2 votes go to D. So that'll be A6, E5, C4, D5. So C is now out, and C's 4 votes go to B. No, they don't. B is eliminated, so they go to D. And that makes E the smallest, and its votes go to D as well. So D wins by 14 to 6. Then we have what is called approval voting, which doesn't recognize preferences at all. If you have voted for something, then either you think it's brilliant, or you think it's good, or you think, well, it's okay. And all 20 people are being very consensual and polite and blah, blah, blah. And only F is a bit of intransigent. So F wins. F gets 21 approvals, and all the others get only 20. If you use the Borda count, then you add up all the points, and option B is indeed the winner. And if you do the same with Condorcet, then B is also the Condorcet winner. And in many voters' profiles, the modified Borda count winner is also the Condorcet winner. And it's a bit like a football league or something. And if you have 5 teams, and either you get the team that wins the most matches, or the team which scores the most goals. And the one that scores the most goals is probably the team that wins the most matches. So normally the modified Borda count and Condorcet, they coincide. And basically, the result of this analysis and many other analyses show that plurality voting is, or can be, hopelessly inaccurate, and anything that is based on plurality voting, like the alternative vote or the 2-round system, is also not very good. The approval voting or range voting is even worse, when the voter gets 10 points, and either they can distribute it around or they can plonk. They can put all 10 points, no, this is what I want, and to hell with the rest. And it doesn't encourage interaction at all. So basically, the conclusion is, this is the table of results, and the totally democratic outcome of that voter's profile is either A or B or D or E or F. It all depends upon the voting system. And basically, and I'm quoting here from the Oxford Concise Dictionary of Politics, when there are more than 2 options, Borda and Condorcet are the 2 best interpretations of majority rule. I now want to spend just a little time talking about self-determination, which was President Woodrow Wilson. And this was 1918, as I'm sure you all know, and in his retirement, he said this: "I did not know that there were 1 million Germans in Bohemia, in the Sudetenland." But basically, the theory is that if you have a great big country, and the majority want to live in this great big country, then that's okay, because that's democracy. But if a minority live in one corner, and if a majority of the minority want to opt out, then of course they may, because that's democracy. And if a minority of the minority want to opt out of opting out and opt back in again, or whatever, and if a majority of the minority want to do this, then they may, because that's democracy. And this is a formula for permanent conflict until every 2 people is an independent nation state. It's crazy. We started it, I'm afraid, in 100 years ago, when Ireland opted out of the UK, so Northern Ireland opts out of Ireland, and we've been arguing about it ever since. Well, not quite. We've now settled down. But the same mistakes were repeated in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. I often quote this one. Dreadful. So knowing that something is wrong with majority voting, some people have suggested that we should have consociational voting. And this is basically, as you will know, if a majority of these say yes and a majority of those say yes, then the answer is yes. And here it was Czechs and Slovaks, which doesn't say much for the Moravians, but well, never mind. And in Belfast, it's if the Catholics, majority of the Catholics say yes, the majority of the Protestants say yes, then that's okay. And in Bosnia, you need a majority of the Muslims and the Orthodox and the Catholics, so it gets a bit more complicated there. And this idea of consociationism might work in Belgium, but it does perpetuate the very problem that you're trying to overcome, namely sectarianism, because you have to designate the people who are voting as, are you a Catholic or a Protestant or whatever? And also to reduce everything to a dichotomy when you are in a divided society is not perhaps the best idea. That idea of a majority of these and a majority of those, it could have come from the Belfast Agreement actually, but it actually came from an earlier document written here, 30 years before the Belfast Agreement was even thought about. So you could say that the Belfast Agreement is Очень Sovietsky, такой. But to criticize that in Belfast doesn't go down very well. So, okay, now I'm going to go to consensus voting, which is the modified border count in decision-making, and then the quota border system in elections, and the metrics vote in governance. And the other two, the two second ones I'll talk about maybe on another occasion. We'll just talk about decision-making for the moment. So basically, you decide who is going to be involved, and the democratic process must allow those concerned to be involved in choosing the options. We have moved beyond Napoleon, when he, it's normally a he, when he decides what the question is, and then, in most cases, which David Cameron has learned to his cost, but only in most cases, not in all, the question is usually the answer. When it's a dictator, it's almost always the answer. So you must allow the people or their representatives to be involved in choosing the options, and then you must allow those concerned to cast their preferences. And with the modified border count, you actually identify at best the option which has the highest average preference, and the word average means everybody is involved. Nobody wins everything, but everybody wins something, and it's a different ballgame. So if you have 5 options, if you vote for only one option, then you get 1 point. And this is the original rule as advocated by Jean-Charles de Borda. If you cast 2 preferences, then your favorite gets 2 points, and your second preference gets 1 point. And if you vote 3, and if you vote all 5, then fine. So if you want your favorite to win, it is a good idea if actually you cast all your preferences, if you recognize the validity of all the other options, the aspirations of, well, they are your neighbors. And the biggest advantage of all is that the protagonist, whether he's called Boris Johnson or whatever, he will be enticed. It is to his advantage to get his supporters to cast their preferences. It's a completely different atmosphere. And we've used this many times in Belfast and then further afield, most recently in China, and it's always worked. So I'm asking you to consider it as well. If you have, there will be some people who have partial votes, and I don't like the idea of forcing people to vote anyway. So you encourage them, but you don't force them. And with this system, if you go back to the profile that we were looking at earlier, then the modified border count is the same as the border count if everybody casts all of their preferences. So the first 2 rows, the only difference is with F right at the end there. And with the modified border count, it gets 21 points, but with the border count, it gets 26. Then the next 2 examples, if one of the C supporters casts a first preference only, then C, which had been second, shown here in white, is now a joint second third. With the border count, yes, C now wins, but with the modified border count, it goes down. And if all 4 C voters cast only partial votes, then C is, with the MBC, C is now third. Whereas with the border count, the C comes first. If you are talking about a voting system which allows people to cast more than one preference, then you want a system in which a voter, in casting their second preference, it doesn't detract from his/her first preference. With approval voting, it does detract. And as I said earlier, approval voting, and even more so range voting, it encourages the intransigent to be so. In many situations where people are nice anyway and they're being nice to each other, approval voting is fine. But in the realpolitik of Boris Johnson and the like, no, it wouldn't work. With the alternative vote, it allows you to cast a second preference, but it's a bit neutral on whether it's you can or you can't, and you still get your first preference. But with the modified Borda count, it actually encourages you to cast all your preferences. It encourages you to be consensual. And my God, that's what we need at the moment. Thank you very much.